Hello everyone. So today we are going to cover pharmacy law, and this is going to be kind of a long lecture. So I'm going to try and break it up into a couple different videos. So to start off with, in your textbook you will find this list of organizations that are very heavy. Let me move my little head out of the way here, that are very focused on federal government. So things that you might be familiar with, like the FDA, the DEA, which is Drug Enforcement Administration. We're going to talk a little bit about where the DEA came from and where it started from. You may have heard of OSHA. And then there's a few other ones, Healthcare Financing Administration, HEFA, HHS, which is the Department of Health and Human Services. One of the big ones is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is CMS. That is an authority that oversees reimbursements under Medicare and Medicaid governmental insurance programs. Medicare is more commonly used for people that have retired or is elderly in age. And then Medicaid is for low income, people that are below poverty level and need insurance. And then the other organizations that are probably important for you to know are the ones that are professional organizations and associated with pharmacy. One of the more popular ones are the National Association of Board of Pharmacy. This is one that you register with, and it's free to register, but they will monitor all your CEs, your continuing education courses. They also provide some free continuing education courses. The American Pharmacists Association, mainly pharmacists belong to this, but technicians can as well. And then the American Society for Health System Pharmacists, ASHP, which oversees a lot of our educational programs, and that's what our accreditation would come from, is that organization. So those are some of the organizations that are really important for you to review and know. But first off, pharm law. Pharmacy law is really a statutory law which is passed by legislative bodies. It can be either in federal or state or local. And pharmacy law can change from state to state. So as a pharmacy technician or a pharmacist, you typically have to register within the state that you practice. So in some states, it requires you to take a law exam, particularly to be a pharmacist. You have to take a state pharmacy law exam. In the state of Texas, as a pharmacy technician, you don't have to take a separate law exam, but of your continuing education courses, one of the hours that you do has to be associated with law. So some examples that break out federal from state to local. An example would be a federal law oversees the drug called morphine. The DEA controls it. It considers it a scheduled medication, which we're going to talk about. Texas state has mandated epinephrine, and then the local has adjusted pseudoephedrine. State does some ephedrine issues, and then local has done some pseudoephedrine issues as well. We're going to talk about that in the combat methamphetamine law, which is going to come up later. So that's how they kind of break out law. But when we look at law as well, we can look at regulatory law. And it's covering up some of my words. I'm going to close this down a little bit, the FDA. But regulatory law is established by the FDA and the State Board of Pharmacy, and it's usually a written rule or procedure that exists to carry out a law. So a statutory law is something that is made by the government, state or federal usually, and has to be followed. A regulatory law is taking those and writing a rule or procedure that is carried out, that carries out that specific law. The difference between a regulatory law and a standard is a guideline or a benchmark that desires a level of care. So you're setting, an example is using ingredients or manufacturing standards to make sure you're providing good care. So those are some terms that you're going to hear about throughout this. But now we're going to go into the laws and all these different statutory laws that exist. And the very first law that ever was published was, let me see if I can make me smaller a little bit so I'm not covering up words, is the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And this came about because it prohibited the interstate transportation and sales of adulterated or misbranded drugs. And adulterated drugs were medications that had contaminants in it, had drugs in there that they did not communicate, had certain side effects. Basically, there was something wrong with it. And misbranded was that they said it was used for this and it was used for something completely different. Back in the early 1900s, there's no regulation on medication. You could do whatever you want. There wasn't as much medication as there is today, obviously, but they really could do whatever they wanted. And the same thing with drugs were true for food. So they could have contaminated food, they could have contaminated, like bacteria or poisons or, lead, or basically substances that were unsafe in medication and or food. And one of the examples is Coca-Cola. So when Coca-Cola first came out, the stimulant in Coca-Cola was actually cocaine. So the very original Coca-Cola product had actual cocaine in the product. And they realized that cocaine was a stimulant and an addictive form of medication or drug. So they made Coca-Cola say that it was in there. And when that happened, they were like, oh, that's probably not a good idea. So what they ended up doing was changing the stimulant from cocaine to caffeine. So that is kind of where the word Coke or Coca-Cola came from. That's why the name cocaine is referred to on the street as Coke, because it used to be in Coca-Cola. So kind of an interesting little story about Coke, Coca-Cola. Following the FDA, in 1938, the FDA didn't really exist. I mean, we had the Food and Drug Act, but it really didn't exist. But in 1938, this was the creation of the FDA, and it was a Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 that created the FDA. And it required that pharmaceutical manufacturers file for a new drug application with the FDA. So if they wanted to make a new medication or a new drug, they had to file an application to do so. Manufacturers submitted new drug data to the FDA for approval to market a new drug, to manufacture, and must have been proved that the drug is safe and effective for the intentions that it indicated. You could not research or manufacture a new medication unless it did what it said. Now, this here, the investigation of the New Drug Act, that actually came later, so hold on to that. The other thing is the new drug application is submitted for drug approval. So these were some of the requirements that this law required. So they had to send in that NDA, and they had to write on there what it was used for. As we went on, that abbreviated new drug application, that form was to be submitted to FDA to get approval for marketing a generic product. So this came a little bit later as well, and we're going to talk about how this law kind of extended upon itself. And we'll talk more about generic drugs in just a little bit. But it basically clarified the law of 1906, the Food and Drug Act. That's what the whole point of the FDCA of 1938 was. But the one thing it did not do is it did not require drugs to be effective or useful. So they could say this is what would happen, but it didn't necessarily require it to be a useful thing, which later comes into play as we move on into our laws. So In 1951, we started seeing an increase in types of medications, and they started separating out. So we went from what we call legend drugs to non-prescription drugs. Legend drugs are prescription drugs, ones that you have to go up to the counter, bring your prescription, the pharmacist, farm techs fill it, you purchase it, and you go home, and it comes home in a little amber bottle. Over-the-counter medications are medications that are found that you can walk into a pharmacy, pick off the shelf, and go and check out at the cashier. So an example would be Claritin or Advil or any of those types of drugs that you can get without having a prescription. So how do I remember this? I was actually taught this, and I think it's very helpful. Durham-Humphrey Amendment of 1952. So I think of Humphrey, I think of Humpty Dumpty fell over the counter. Instead of over the wall, Humpty Dumpty fell over the counter. And that might help you remember that this separated legend prescription drugs from non-prescription over-the-counter medications. The other thing that it did do is that it did require all legend drugs or prescription drugs to have this caution label placed on it. Caution, federal law prohibits the transfer of this drug to any person other than the patient for whom it was prescribed. So that was the other thing the Durham-Humphrey Amendment covered. So the next law we're going to talk about is the Kaphar-Harrison Amendment of 1962. And I don't know how well you can see this picture, but you can see the little children here that had short arms. This was where the INDA came into effect. I remember I mentioned it in the 1938 FTCA, but it wasn't quite there yet. And this law came into effect because we realized that all the drugs that were being out there were not necessarily effective, and they were harming patients. And this particular law came out from the 1950s because many children were being born with short limbs and short arms, particularly in Great Britain, in England. And there was research found out that there was a drug that was being used by pregnant women to help with morning sickness or nausea. And the drug was called thalidomide. And thalidomide was the drug that actually it interferes with angiogenesis, which is the building of red blood vessels. Angio is vessels, arteries, vessels, and genesis is to create. And it interfered with that, its ability to do that. So when the fetus in the womb of the mother, the thalidomide stopped the growth of these blood vessels, and it resulted in short arms and short limbs, short legs. So they would be born with what they called stubs. And they didn't know that this drug was causing it until later, and they finally tracked it back through an investigation. So that's where the Kaphar-Harrison Amendment came in 1962, where they required that drugs be effective and that the manufacturer file an investigational new drug application with the FDA. And what that did is they actually had to do trials on this medication before it could be marketed. So huge change. This was a huge law. They investigated the drug being used in clinical trials and not FDA approved for general population until it goes through these clinical trials. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to come back with part 2 here in just a minute, and we are going to talk about probably one of the biggest laws out there, the Comprehensive Drug Prevention and Control Act of 1970.